That was not his first time in China. You were twice before in Beijing and once in Shanghai, if I remember correctly.
And twice in Taiwan, if you count that?
Twice in Taiwan, we certainly count that. Of course we count that. And then, if I recall, also you had experience with Afghanistan as well. So you've been in dealing with policy in combat zones and in the very heart of great power competition. So I was hoping that we could start with you so that you could give us, competitive space, as you heard the Secretary say, is not just about the military. What does this contest between the United States and China look more broadly in the competitive space? Big picture. Foreign policy, diplomacy, trade, allies, money, all the things that, culture, all the things that would make up a competitive space. How's China doing? And how are we doing relative to China?
Thanks, Sharon. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Really appreciate it.
And I really appreciated the way Randy talked about our national security strategy and the fact that China has been operating on a similar national security strategy. They're much better at not talking about, at doing things quietly. In other words, our system is not well designed for saying one thing and doing another. So I would say this strategy has the benefit, the new national security strategy, like Randy said, has the benefit of being more upfront about where we are. The Chinese, I think, are less upfront, but I think certainly it has been a motivating. The competition, the sense that they measure themselves against us, both in positive competitive terms, the way Randy talked about it, but also in very adversarial terms at times. I think that's a useful measure. I was happy Randy sort of moved quickly away from trade in his initial response. I'm glad he went back to it because I think that's a really important factor. I think what has been our advantage has been our broad engagement, not just security, and I think the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, but more globally, is interested in the United States security presence, but they're much more interested in a broad-based American commitment to the region. And Randy's right that investment is different from trade. I think of trade as interests and investment as values. That investment works if you share the same values, if you have the same commitment to rule of law and sanctity of contracts and that sort of thing. And that's, I think, a real benefit to the of what we bring to the region. And that's what I think he put a good face on the withdrawal from TPP. I think it was a real blow. I think I take great issue with the Trump administration for having pulled out of TPP. But I take same issue with Hillary Clinton, who also ran against TPP in the election, didn't make the case for American leadership, and with the Obama administration, which negotiated TPP, but sort of the strategy for passage was to hope that Hillary would win and pass it in the lame duck session. So we will look back at that if we don't find a way back into TPP with real regret. One thing that I thought about as he was talking is our $1 trillion annual defense investment, $700 billion to DoD directly, the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Department of Energy that works on nuclear weapons programs. Is that kind of the Maginot Line? Are we building this huge infrastructure, but sort of letting the other parts of the competition hollow out? Because it is.
Can you answer that question?
I worry about that.
Or is it a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That I know that the strategy talks all about competition, but it's right next to lethality, right? And so, I mean, if all we're doing is building a war machine, are we inevitably heading for war?
It's a real risk. I worry about it. And Atul Gawande, I don't know if he's the New Yorker writer, talks about the health system in the United States, talks about how we just love intervention, that specialists and the really high-end medicine gets a lot of attention, a lot of resources in the U.S. system, and primary care kind of gets overlooked. And if you look at compensation of doctors, that sort of thing, it's all out of whack in terms of what's effective in terms of outcomes versus what's remunerative in terms of being a medical professional. And I think about the same sort of construct in terms of national security, that that we have the lethality as that intervention, and it's really exciting stuff, and it's interesting, and it grabs the attention of the American people and people who pass budgets and the political system. But really what's effective in a lot of cases is primary care, which is diplomacy and trade and investment and culture and that sort of things, which is getting short shrift.
Which is a great segue, and we're gonna have a dialogue here too, which is a great segue to Dr. Nancy Sung, who is a senior science advisor at the National Science Foundation, which is one of the great engines of innovation and research and development in this country. Until very recently, I think just a couple months ago, she ran NSF's China office. So she was the head of that office. But she herself is a very distinguished scientist, has a PhD in microbiology, I believe, and was at the Burroughs Wellcome Fund before she came to NSF in 2011. So she's been an innovator herself and has for some time now been responsible for seed funding innovation. So what I wanted you to talk about is, if we're talking again about what exactly is this competitive space and who's winning, you know, what Dave just said, it's more than just military materiel. It's also about research and development and innovation. So how are we doing and how are the Chinese doing?
Okay, great question. It's great to be here as well, and great to be with you again, Dave, and it was a privilege to work with you.
Yeah, mine too.
So I have one visual that I want to show that I think, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And I think you told me to push the white button. Is that right? Yes.
There it is.
So I don't know if you can see that. It's a little light, but this is the, over time, on the left you have from 1981 going up to 2015. This is gross domestic expenditures on R&D among different countries. This is from NSF's Science and Engineering Indicators that we publish every 2 years. And what I want you to notice, the top line there going up is the United States investment over time. The line that I want to draw your attention to is China, which is the pink, lighter colored line. And what's very unusual about it, the way it's not like the other lines, is its slope. You can see it's really doing nothing until about 2003, and then it just begins to go like this, to rocket upward. And what we see there is China's priority on research and development, on science and technology, investing just the way we did in our post-war period when NSF was created. Our investment in the S&T, we believed that would make our economy strong, would make our country strong. China knows this, and you can see the evidence here of their investment over the last couple of decades, to the point where it's now projected that that line will cross our investment within the next couple of years. And so certainly in terms of funding, providing money for science, China is right there with us and has no intention, it seems, of slowing down. The slope has stayed in double-digit increases over the last couple of years, whereas ours has been relatively flat. So that's one way. Another is in publications. Scientists measure their contribution not in lethality, but in publications. How are we, the pebbles we're throwing on the mountain of knowledge. And China has now surpassed all but the United States in the number of scientific publications. And not just in the number, but in the quality. The quality of those publications is rising. The journal Nature has their Nature Index every year, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences is the top-rated institute. Now, granted, it's 100 institutes in earth science and chemistry and physics, and is, I think, number 5 in life sciences. So certainly, in terms of the impact of the science that's being done, China is rising and is on a par with us in many fields. Another thing I'll point out is that our collaboration with China, U.S.-China collaboration, we work together with each other more than either of us does with any other country. So we're each other's most important collaborator. And I think this has grown out of the Science and Technology Agreement that we signed with China in 1979 that created the platform for this cooperation. And so tens of thousands of Chinese scientists have come and trained in the U.S. Increasingly, many of them are going back. So one of the ways China is making use of this money is in recruiting the best minds back to China. Not only ethnically Chinese, but others who are smart people around the world. This is exactly what the U.S. has done. Our scientific enterprise is built largely on immigrants. And I think in the fields of engineering in particular, maybe 70% of the postdocs are foreign-born in the U.S. So this is something that China is doing. So maybe one thing I'll point out, we've talked about the competitive space. I think where NSF sits is in what I would call the pre-competitive space. We're in basic science. So these are blue sky discoveries, things that may or may not ever turn into a commercial product or a weapon, but really very basic discovery. And so this is where NSF has sought to work with China, not because it's China, but because we work anywhere in the world where we can advance the science and where there are great ideas. And so increasingly, maybe I'll quote Pete Suttmeyer, who's a scholar of China's S&T system, where he's pointed out that the benefit has been asymmetric. That since 1979, the benefit has flowed mostly to China of that S&T agreement. You can see their enterprise has risen. And now we're sort of at a par, and we may get to the point where the asymmetry may begin to point where we can benefit from collaborating with China in terms of access to facilities that they're building, world-class facilities, access to experts, access to unique research sites. So the benefit may begin to flow toward us if we don't pull out now. So one way I like to think of it, it's my personal opinion, not NSF's opinion, is I wouldn't want to see us sell when the market is low, pull out at the point right when we may begin to benefit by cooperating, and again, in these basic science fields. And one other comment is that the way NSF interacts with China, we don't support Chinese scientists, we only support American scientists. And if they're collaborating with Chinese scientists, we work closely with the Chinese science agencies to support those projects in an equal way, in a reciprocal way. So that's how we approach it. So that reciprocity is very much in our mind, as is supporting only those things where we can articulate the clear benefit to the United States.
So you actually see a future where competition, scientific competition, at least in basic science, with China doesn't have to be hostile. It can be collaborative,
Right.
that it's possible.
Yes.
And that's based on your time there and watching the way that US and Chinese scientists interact.
Yes, and also when we bring complementary expertise to a big problem. So for example, one of our very new partnerships with China is in the ecology and evolution of infectious disease. So this is not curing diseases, it's not going out and controlling an epidemic, it's how do we understand the mechanisms of disease transmission from one species to another, the real basic kind of stuff. And in China, because you have so much population, concentrated, massive changes in land use, this is an amazing laboratory for these kinds of questions. And so we want to establish those ties to work with those scientists so that maybe someday if we have a pandemic, we're able to work with them. We have good communication and trust on that very basic level. So I see that as not competition, but as collaboration, really.
You did mention, though, that there are a couple of areas where the Chinese have become competitive with the United States, and you're not talking about basic science. Can you mention a couple of those places?
Well, certainly in artificial intelligence, this is an area where a year ago, China announced a very aggressive policy. By 2030, they wanted to be the world leader in this area. And I think just this week, they kind of backed off of that a little bit and said, oh, we want to cooperate internationally in this field. So I think that in the AI field, I'm not sure I'd say that they're on a par with us. I think they have different capabilities. China has a lot of data. I think what makes AI a very rich field is the kind of data that you have. And in many areas, China just, by nature of its population, has a huge amount of data. And what the US can bring is expertise in what kind of questions do you ask of that data. And that's something where I think the US expertise is quite valuable to China. And we have to think about where are the areas where we're going to cooperate in AI. NSF is not seeking to collaborate with China in some of those areas. We're choosing other areas where there's more of a peer relationship and where the cooperation is clearly to our benefit.
Dave, I know we've heard that that there's intellectual property theft in there, but also a lot of American companies have willingly, gladly gone to China. So is that a problem, or have they given away intellectual property to their competitors?
Sure. I mean, most of those, I think the idea of intellectual property theft is clearly it's a problem, but an awful lot of it is just American businesses faced with the price of entering the China market have made the short-term decision that it makes economic sense to give up that property, that intellectual property as part of the deal.
And that has long-term consequences.
It has long-term consequences, and I think there are a lot of issues where it's just a fundamentally different approach to how we organize our systems, right? That there is a top-level sort of commitment to helping Chinese entities strike that bargain, right? To say to state-level support to say, you're going to welcome American investment, but we'll help you drive the hardest bargain possible.
Let's switch gears a little bit and go to Dr. Leon Clark. And of course, I know Leon quite well, but I realized I was going to have to read some of your bio because you lead the Integrated Modeling and Energy Group at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, which has the happy acronym of JICRI, in case you're wondering. But that's a collaboration between the University of Maryland and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is also where you hang your hat. And Dr. Clark is a very seasoned scientist who's been a leader in the intergovernmental, IPCC. It's one of those things where the acronym's easier than the name. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and was a member of the National Academies of Science panel on climate choices, America's climate choices. He's also worked at Lawrence Livermore and at PG&E. He has advanced degrees in mechanical engineering and engineering economic systems and operations research. Now you know why I had to read it, even though I know you. What I was hoping you would talk to us about is now the undergirding of all of this are the natural resources in these countries. And I was hoping you could tell us about China's energy, water, land, food, people nexus, and what that looks like, where their strengths and weaknesses are, and if you would, bring in climate change to that equation too, and how it's going to affect those things.
I'm happy to do my best on the topic. So energy, water, land issues are an issue across the globe, and China is no different. And I guess I'll kind of walk through each of those separately and individually. On the energy side, I think everyone knows that China is a voracious consumer of energy. And much of the issues that come forward on the resource side come from that voracious appetite for energy.
Almost as voracious as we are.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess it's the growing that's the big change in China. But energy, is one of the largest energy consumers. China has traditionally relied extensively on coal. That's where their growth has been. And they have very large coal reserves. But even with that, those coal reserves, they actually import some degree of coal. I want to emphasize both where they're thinking about their own resources, but resources externally, because I think that's very important in the national security space. Oil, obviously, is expanding, oil importer, and I think IEA projects them over time to be the largest oil importer, so that's another obvious place. I think folks in this room more familiar with China's politics than I know that they're also moving towards importing natural gas and have signed an agreement with Russia, actually, for pipeline natural gas. So in the energy sphere, they're a very large consumer, like us, but without necessarily all the resources they want. And they're taking a lot of actions now to address this, and those include both domestic actions and international. On the domestic side, I think folks know that they are probably the largest investors in photovoltaic cells and wind energy. They've actually put a lot of effort into hydroelectric power. So they're going through some very large transitions in their energy sector. And when China does anything, everyone knows they do it big. They do it really big. And so the investments are gigantic there. But also investing, let's say, in petroleum and resources outside of China. So they're both a domestic approach and an international. But that's a very big area for them. In the water space, I think folks know China's always had water issues. They've always had issues where there's more water towards the south and less water towards the north. And that's going to continue to be exacerbated, and is being exacerbated as more people are moving into these urban spaces as well as on the coasts. And so actually it's been, I think it's actually been thousands of years they've had water diversion projects in China, but are now increasingly are doing that again. They have a very large water diversion program to move water from the south to the north. But they potentially face a decent amount of water scarcity issues going forward. And of course that's a domestic issue largely, although there are some transboundary issues as well. On agriculture, China does not actually have the most arable land for the amount of population they have. So they've put a lot of emphasis over time on ensuring that their staple crops are viable. So they produce most of their own wheat, which would be more the north, and most of their own rice. But as they're expanding, as they're changing, as their economy is growing, their diet is changing. And now they're importing fruits and vegetables. They're actually importing a great deal of soy for animal feed, basically to support that changing diet. And so their agricultural system is changing. And in that context, they're both trying to increase efficiency as well as, again, going internationally and are a large investment in land throughout the world to try and maintain their supply of food. So that's kind of where they are now, just at a broad brush level in the energy, water, land space. And I think it's important to note that, as the former speakers mentioned, it's a top-down approach, and so they are definitely taking actions, and they include both international actions and they include domestic actions. In the climate space, I'll just put three things on the table. One is just in general, they have some of the same classic climate things we all note, increases in extreme events like hurricanes, floods, and so forth. One thing to note specifically in that space is that much of China's population and economic activities in urban centers that are in coastal regions, and their coast is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. Now, that's not going to happen immediately, but to the extent that China thinks about planning ahead, that's something that they're certainly paying attention to. But there's also issues associated with heat waves, which will be increasing, and as an increasingly urban population, they'll see those. So those sort of classic climate stuff is going to play out, which has your general effects. But I'll put two topics that I think are pretty important. One is that China is connected with the rest of the world. And so let's just take an example in agriculture. One thing we often think about with climate and agriculture is how will the climate affect our own domestic production? And there's really open questions, I think, I don't know if that's me or not, open questions about how climate is going to influence domestic agriculture, and that's something we're starting to look into, I'll mention and work with Sharon. But it's not just domestic. What really is going to matter is a lot of these trade patterns as well. Climate affects everybody around the world, and in fact, recent work that we've done and other folks have done looking at the U.S., which has a large export characteristic, has found that the impacts of climate change on the U.S. over the long run are equally important emerging from climate from our trading partners, changing international prices for goods as they are on the production that happens domestically. And I think that sort of issue is something that we really need to be thinking about in the China space as well, and I know they're thinking about those issues. And then finally, the final point I'll make in climate is that it's not just about climate impacts, it's about climate policy. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of those energy system changes that are happening in China, some of them are happening, they're happening for a variety of reasons. One is energy security, moving to more domestic resources, renewable energy, and so forth. Another is air pollution is a huge play in China for reducing its coal consumption. Also geopolitical leadership in the climate space. But once you're playing in the climate space, and China is making big investments. How much is the climate? How much is these domestic interests is not clear. But big investments in changing their energy system, those could have big implications over time. So this large investments in solar power, that has implications for trade in solar power or trade in the resources for solar power, but also it has implications for them creating a domestic industry, which I think everyone knows has flooded the world with solar cells, and that has important trade implications. If they try and deal with their transport system, they'll either have to go towards batteries, which has implications for that industry, or biofuels, which might influence what happens in agriculture, or trade in bioenergy. And so all of these sorts of, and if they go into nuclear, we can all, I think this group probably has a lot of expertise in the implications of nuclear power. So all of those changes in the energy system, I think, are coming for a variety of reasons, including climate mitigation. Again, we can comment on how much that's the biggest, but those also, I think, will have very big ramifications over time. And make no mistake, some of this stuff is coming. We have different opinions about climate change mitigation, but some of it is happening, and it will have implications for their industry. So those are my remarks in this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I want to put the audience on notice that we're going to bring you in a minute, and particularly want to acknowledge Rear Admiral David Titley hiding in the back there, who's an advisor to our project. Hopefully we'll get a question from you, David, so I'm just putting you on notice. Geopolitical implications of both China's climate diplomacy and their energy now, you know,
Right.
we used to have their pattern,
Right.
60% dependent on imports. As Leon was saying, I mean, they're now Saudi Arabia's biggest customer, and that changes geopolitics, right?
Absolutely. So I was thinking, I remember 20, 30 years ago thinking, why are we not making the case for energy, for sort of switching to renewable energy on a geopolitical, on a sort of national interest basis of we are beholden to the Middle East, we're tied to the Middle East. You know, Randy talked about the pivot or the rebalance to Asia. The reason we can talk about that is that we're not, we are now not independent, but much less dependent on Middle East oil. So we can think about extracting ourselves from a place that has been an unprofitable investment for the United States geopolitically for a long time. I think China, probably part of what motivates what they're doing on clean energy, a lot of it is domestic air pollution, that sort of thing. A lot of it is the geopolitical benefit of being a leader on climate issues. But part of it is having watched what the United States did for 30, 40 years and not wanting to have that.
To walk down the same road.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting segue to a different kind of resource where we may be all walking down the same path. And I'm delighted to have Dr. Andrew Gully here to talk to us about it. He's an analyst for the National Minerals Information Center at the U.S. Geological Survey. And he's done a lot of research on China's development of advanced technologies and direct foreign investments, and specifically with non-fuel minerals. You were at the Colorado School of Mines before, you got your PhD there, and have been looking at these things for some time and doing some really interesting research. So talk to us about this, about critical minerals and why this is so important in the competitive space.
Yeah, so I think probably a good place to start would be to talk about kind of why I'm here and why non-fuel minerals matter. So you've talked about moving to renewable energies. These renewable energies require elements and minerals that have very specific physical qualities. So they're crucial to a lot of these emerging and advanced technologies. And so let's see. So historically, resource conflicts have often centered on fuel minerals. So oil. Future resource conflicts may, however, focus more on competition for non-fuel minerals that enable such technologies. These technologies are enabled by an increasing number of minerals that are subject to supply disruption and indispensable to these technologies that we've talked about.
So this includes the cell phone that everyone has in their pocket right now. It's a periodic table in there, right?
Yes, and specifically a lot of these minerals that are crucial for smartphones are also crucial for sort of guidance systems and that are in the military applications that could be driving next generation. So in recent decades, China has gained influence over availability of many of these minerals, but no nation has all of the minerals that they need domestically. So in terms of delineating the competitive space, you can look at net import reliance. And so if you compare China and the United States in terms of net import reliance, which quantifies how much of a country's domestic consumption is obtained from foreign sources, a country is highly import reliant when its net import reliance is greater than 50%. So minerals that China has the comparative advantage over the United States are those where United States has high import reliance, but China doesn't. So this is the common narrative of mineral consumption and production globally, is that China's holding all the cards, the United States is dependent on these minerals from China. So 42 minerals studied for this comparison, 13 fit this category, and China is a leading supplier of US imports for 9. So I'll go through these briefly just to give you an idea of why these minerals matter and what their applications are. So antimony and bismuth are inputs for ammunition and semiconductors. Cobalt's an input to jet engine superalloys, lithium-ion batteries, and permanent magnets. Gallium, germanium, indium, and tellurium are byproduct minerals. They're not economically feasible to mine on their own, which are inputs into satellite solar cells, infrared imaging, integrated circuits, and semiconductors. Yttrium and rare earths are the sort of poster child of this issue. And they're inputs to guidance systems, radar, sonar, and also permanent magnets. But it's important to remember that there are a whole slew of these types of specialized minerals. It's not just rare earth elements. So it's worth remembering that Chinese manufacturers now dominate many downstream industries that consume rare earth elements, which were previously robust in the United States. It's also worth remembering that there was a disruption of Chinese rare earth exports to Japan during a 2010 diplomatic dispute. So China now produces more than 70% of global production for 6 of the minerals with the aforementioned applications. In terms of the national defense strategy, China, and not the United States, may be expanding the competitive space for these minerals and their downstream industries. On the other hand, minerals that the United States may have a comparative advantage over China are those for which China is highly import reliant, but the United States is not. So this isn't a common narrative here, is that the Chinese have weaknesses also. So of 42 minerals, roughly 8 fit this category. China has addressed supply risks related to 2 of these via infrastructure for minerals agreements in Africa, namely copper and cobalt mine material. Then 1 via domestic capacity expansion, so high purity gallium. So this reflects what you were saying earlier, is that they use a combination of long-term strategic planning that leverages domestic capabilities, whether it would be mining or just building, smelting infrastructure or purifying infrastructure. But if they can't do it domestically, then they'll go overseas. It takes a decade to develop a mine. So if this is something that you want now, you need to think about what are we going to be manufacturing in 2025? And the Chinese do this, and they think about what is it that we want to manufacture in this time period, what are the inputs, what's the capacity that's related, and where do we need to go? Because geology assigns these deposits to only particular locations. So of 42 minerals, 8 fit this category, that China is import reliant, but the United States isn't. Notably, the United States is the dominant global producer of only 1 of these 8, which is beryllium. And so why? Beryllium's position represents a concerted effort by the US government, most recently in 2005 through the Defense Production Act, Title III, to establish and maintain reliable domestic supply. So this is the one example that we have in the United States of a comparative advantage over China.
And of a deliberate government policy to promote a comparative advantage.
Yes. So finally, the new competitive space may prove most contentious for 11 minerals for which China and the United States are both highly import reliant upon foreign sources of production, which are all concentrated. So I think that the key takeaways are that the United States has many comparative weaknesses in terms of foreign critical mineral supply risks, many of which are sourced from China. China also has weaknesses, but strategic planning over the last decade allows them to address these via domestic and foreign abilities. So China and the United States are more likely to compete for the 11 minerals that they need for manufacturing but don't have domestically. Geographically, the largest producing countries of these minerals are Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, South Africa, Chile, and Brazil. China's mineral supply and demand may affect their strategic choices relating to non-fuel minerals in these countries.
So that's the competitive space, those
Yes.
5 countries.
So I think, so
Yeah, I mean,
geographically. Yeah.
because if you're talking about these minerals are critical to the information age economy, all high tech that we all, did you ever think about why your screen is reactive? It's because of what's in there. So, I mean, everything that drives the current modern economy and current modern militaries. I know we still have a lot of legacy platforms that we invest in this country, but the next war is going to be about high tech, and it's going to be unmanned systems and robots, artificial intelligence, and that all depends on these same things. So 5 countries, that's the competitive space, or part of it, right? This is a knowable thing. And the Chinese get this, and they've made investments in all of those countries, correct?
Correct. And so I think one of the, an interesting piece in terms of sort of economic or trade competition is that, when you develop a deposit, when a Chinese state-owned entity goes into a foreign country and with foreign direct investment and purchases a mine or a processing facility, they also have to build infrastructure to get to that mine. So as we all know, Chinese state-owned entities are building massive amounts of infrastructure in Africa. That helps not only to get resources out, but also to create export markets for things that they want in. So when you look at how these infrastructure agreements are put together in coordination between Chinese banks, Chinese oil and gas companies, mining firms, and infrastructure development, you have a situation where the typical forces of competition where the United States firms might enter multinational corporations headquartered in Britain, Australia, Canada, or Europe, that's difficult to compete with because you have a relationship directly between Beijing and a host government, and so it changes the landscape in a way that makes it more difficult for market-oriented economies or governments to enter.
I know we started late, and so that means we're already over time, but if you all can stay a little bit longer, we can take a couple of questions or comments from the audience. Yes, sir, and if you would please identify yourself. Oh, sorry, I know who you are, Joshua. I was looking past you, but no, I didn't mean to not know who you are, so please ask your question. You must be like, sir, what?
Yeah, I thought it was weird because you already introduced me earlier today. I have a lot of questions, but I'm assuming I'm going to limit it to just one that I think maybe I'm the most interested in. So Nancy, I'm very, very interested in the conversation around China's advantage in investing in technology, and especially in things like next generation AI, quantum computing. Obviously, more direct military technologies like hypersonics and et cetera. But what I hear from people, especially from sort of AI researchers within my programs, is that when they go to the big conferences, it's now gotten to the point where there are more papers, there are more talks by people from Chinese institutions than every other place combined. But what they see is that their judgment is that the papers and the solutions are typically marginal improvements on existing technologies as opposed to new creative solutions for new types of AI, for new types of machine learning solutions, et cetera. So the assessment is that we still have a creativity advantage, if not a strictly R&D investment advantage or number of published papers advantage. What do you think about that? Do you think it's valid? Do you think it'll hold? Do you think it's useful?
I think that our creativity advantage remains, but like the previous speaker, I wouldn't want to underestimate it, because if you put the number of really bright people that China is recruiting back into the mainland, and you give them resources, it's like an incubator. Something's going to grow. Now, the countervailing force would be the increasing controls on freedom of thought, the sorts of things that you can research, the kind of questions you can ask, the things you can say. This is where our enterprise has just been amazing, really a wonder of the world, and the truly blue sky environment that we have here, where I think scientists in China are somewhat constrained. I mean, they may have resources and be able to do that, but it remains to be seen whether the system, the increasingly controlling system in China, will allow this kind of creativity to emerge in fields like that. And that is precisely where, at the moment, if you have a big instrument or a very expensive piece of equipment, but you don't know what question to ask, what's the next really great question? It's just an expensive piece of equipment. And I think that's something where our system continues to produce people who think this way. I think the Chinese system really aspires to create those sorts of people and to bring those sorts of people in, but it remains to be seen whether it will be done to the degree that it's been done here.
Stephen Brumby in the back, and then David, and then Stephen was like standing up and waving his hand. So, oh, okay, we're going to do David.
Okay, yeah, I
'Cause
try
Wyatt
to
knows.
make this not a spring butt kind of thing here. Yeah, again, so many questions, so little time. So I'm Dave Titley. I'm a professor at Penn State now, former naval officer. One of the things I noticed when coming back to campus is I almost need a fluency in Mandarin to understand most of the conversations I hear while walking around. And Penn State's nothing special other than it's a typical state, big state R1 institution, so big research institution. The former speaker, first speaker, Randy, said that the national security strategy provides clarity and we're trying to remove elephants in the room. To me, it seems like we are training the best and brightest Chinese national minds to go back to China and then compete against us. So while it may not be direct NSF funding, National Science Foundation funding, a tremendous amount of all R1 funding is in fact from the US government, and a lot is from the National Science Foundation. So in regards to competition and how the national security strategy thinks of competition, what are we doing, and is the National Science Foundation concerned about this, or are we happy to see business go as it's been going for the last 15 to 20 years now? Thanks.
No, that's I mean, and there are dollars that American universities all over the country covet and chase. It's a pervasive issue. Are you able to speak to that?
Yeah, I can make a few comments. I don't know if it will directly answer your question, but you're right. There's a tremendous imbalance. There are now over 300,000 Chinese students in the U.S. at all levels, mostly undergrads now. It used to be mostly grad students. And there are, I think, at the moment, maybe 13,000 U.S. students in China. And they're probably mostly studying Chinese, not in S&T fields. And so the flow of insight is one way. So the Chinese scientists who are training here are understanding our system very, very well. We have very little, our next generation of scientists have very little understanding of the system in China, where there will be resources in the future that they may want to access in terms of expertise and facilities. And so I see this maybe isn't the problem you identified, it's another problem, which is this severe imbalance in the level of insight we have about each other's system. And I would love to see federal agencies make it easier for our students to understand the Chinese system and gain insight into it. Yeah, and one thing I can tell you is that in NSF's international office, where I worked before I went to be the head of the office in Beijing, one of the priorities we had on international projects that involved students is we really made giving US students an international experience a very high priority. If a project came in and it said, we're going to do this collaboration and we're going to send 6 students from some out-of-the-way place in America, not even the usual suspects, and give them this international experience so that they can then gain this insight. That's something we believed was a very high priority, and we still do. I think the level of funding that we have to support those kinds of projects has not grown, and in fact, our programs in that area have decreased over the last couple of years. But I would just agree with you that that is an issue we need to pay attention to.
Dave?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm happily out of the government, so I don't have to come up with answers anymore. But it is a real question of how do we compete in the the very good sense of the word that Randy was using. My instinct is, whatever it is, we should look at what our strengths have been, what brought us here, and try to be better Americans. What I see as what brought us here is our openness, our willingness to lead, to create international institutions and structures and rules. And my concern is that we're trying to, at this point in our history, we're sort of taking the wrong lessons, that we're trying to close ourselves off, we're sort of respecting international institutions occasionally when they sort of, which we have always done to some extent, but much more so now when we don't think they meet our immediate interests. And I worry that that's not playing to our strengths. Specifically on how do you deal with education. Part of the reason there are 300,000 students and that many undergraduates is because American public education is underfunded, right? That universities are looking to Chinese students because they're paying full fare, right? Because they're paying $50,000 a year apiece. So,
Yeah, it's a cash cow.
yeah.
Stephen.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Stephen Brumby. I'm one of the people you've kind of been mentioning because I was foreign-born, U.S. citizen, Los Alamos National Lab for 17 years working on machine learning for remote sensing, and then a few years ago became a scientist entrepreneur and have my own company that's actually doing AI technology, and we're funded by DARPA to deliver some of that technology to U.S. government. My question for the panel, and I think the NSF representative, you're being peppered with questions about AI, which is, I think, is my particular area and my question. From the Chinese point of view, what is motivating China's investment in AI? Is it that they see it as something to, and this question for maybe the whole panel, but is it mostly to ensure domestic tranquility from their point of view? Or is it that they're trying to optimize their industries and avoid shutdowns because of their reliance on specific minerals and things? And just overall optimization of the system? Or is it because they also connect it with lethality, and in particular are trying to form an asymmetric advantage where they're no longer, they realize they can't compete with pinnacle legacy systems like F-35 that's the best of its kind in some sense, but is vulnerable, potentially vulnerable to asymmetric threat.
Can I do the glib short answer and let the real people? I mean, I think it's the happy confluence of paranoia and mercantilism, right? They see those sectors, and it's not just AI. There, it's clean energy and a range of. You just look at Made in China 2025, which both are sort of from a national security perspective or a domestic security in the question of internet technologies and AI, help sustain the regime, but also that they're going to be money makers in the future. And
It's all of the above.
I was going to say, was that a question or an answer?
Yeah,
that,
it's not an either or, it's a both and. And I think just China thinks long term. And just looking into the future, this is an area where they see there's an awful lot of the economy will be based on innovations that come out of an AI system. I sat in on a meeting about a year ago with an institute that was using an AI approach to search all the literature in neuroscience, which is our system that we've set up where all of this literature is searchable and available to anyone in the world, to see what are the next things that are emerging in neuroscience that maybe haven't been identified, so that we can then begin to research these threads that are coming up that we don't even realize are new trends. I think I'm not convinced we're not doing that too, but that's the kind of forward thinking, using AI in any and all circumstance. But also it is important to note that China spends an incredible amount of resources on its own internal security, making sure that its own citizens are behaving in certain ways. And I think this is a huge amount of that effort and resources going in that direction as well.
Last question, sir.
Dook Center for Innovation Policy. Just a quick observation about your chart. The reason that the U.S. growth rate looks healthy is principally because of our investment since the 1980s in biomedical research, whereas the fields you pointed out, the Chinese publications are excelling in, are in large part physical science and engineering fields. So there is an important composition question about national investment, but a specific question about students. The administration has proposed, I don't know where these proposals stand, to restrict Chinese students, particularly in the length of time they can spend in the United States. And despite the concern that was expressed, we know that Chinese students are paying tuition, but they're also staffing university laboratories. So restricting Chinese students in the United States could well be shooting ourselves in the foot.
Maybe we're shooting both feet, but
What I have seen, and I haven't made a study of the administration's policies, that it was restricting the validity of visas of certain categories. In other words, if you were in a high-tech field, your visa would be only valid for a certain amount of time. But if you know the U.S. process, I mean, that's the ability to enter the United States. Once you're in, you can stay as long as you're in status as a student or whatever the particular status is. So to me, it doesn't actually address if they have identified a problem. That step will not actually address the problem that they have identified. So it should give no one comfort.
We're well over time, but Mindy, were you waving your hand? No, okay, I just wanted to check. We're over time, but I want to thank you all for coming and for staying past the end of the scheduled event. And if you do have questions you didn't get answered, you may be able to catch these folks and help yourself to coffee and food in the back. I want to thank the panel for a really interesting discussion. And not the last time, I think we'll all be talking about this. So thank you very much.